So hello, everybody. So to introduce myself, my name is Sean Havel. I'm currently an independent research analyst that had worked previously at DRDC Cora, working specifically with NATO in the development of counter disinformation. So the presentation I'm going to show to you today is about new ideas in wargaming information operations, and specifically defending live audiences against adversarial influence. So the agenda today, we're going to be discussing information warfare and information conflict as an idea, the challenges of wargaming in the information environment, and then I'll go into the audience-centric approach we use, which is called SemiE, and then we'll look at some key observations. So the major question that we started was, how can we understand the effects of information on defense? And it's a serious question because information, in a lot of sense, is political, and war is a continuation of politics in its finest meaning. So when we're discussing information operations and foreign adversaries using information to degrade the military capabilities and the military readiness, we need to think that this is not just a battle of sending tweets or sending messages to inflame other sides, but it's really adversaries attempting to frame reality. And that framing of reality has serious military implications. It could be a justification for aggression, and it could make audiences susceptible to that justification. You can disrupt logistical and political processes through the creation of resentment and mass protest. You can degrade general will to fight, but also you can attack directly, and I think this was very much the case in recent history, trying to attack the spirit of a nation, trying to degrade trust in institutions, trust in government, trust in key aspects of society. And so I have some examples. For example, Sputnik talking about military exercise in which a frigate sunk, and they said the unsinkable frigate. But we're also looking at our side of things. CSIS recently posting about foreign influence and creating a very informative video to discuss this. We have the Russian embassy in the United Kingdom discussing Western attempts to sabotage and to create a propaganda campaign. And then we can go over towards Israel. And in Israel, they very much use information and the information about their specific intelligence operations to be able to show effectiveness, but also means. And so I'll posit this image here. And so you can take a look at it. And at first, it seems as if it's a normal image. But if you read into it more closely, of course, NATO does not have 2.3 million forces on the border with Russia. And if you look at the coloring, if you look at the way things are framed, there are many different interpretations. And this one, it's not made by an adversary, it's made by Der Spiegel. And it's the way to frame the situation in Ukraine. But the way in which we frame situations is difficult, to say the least. And wargaming is a challenge, and particularly because the information environment as a whole is essentially where decision action cycles recur in our relevant audiences. And so how I like to think of the information environment, I think it's important to know, is that it is a psychological and physical domain. Psychological in the sense that those elements are unobservable. We cannot see what is happening inside of people's minds and how they interpret and determine material outcomes. But importantly, there's a massive physical element, the tangible elements we can directly observe, and that can be directly acted upon. And so behavior, like I said previously, is influenced by how individuals create a sense of that reality. And we do that through a very classic term, the OODA loop. We observe our physical environment, we orient using our cognitive and sociocultural influences, we decide after we've created a sense of understanding, and then we act. And then we act in the physical environment. So what information then are audiences creating their reality with? What is impacting the orientation? How is that information changing audience psychological reasoning? Which actors are creating this information, for what purpose, and who is joining the fight, so to say, in quotation marks? The fight being why are people supporting certain actions online? Why are people supporting certain narratives online? What is causing people to fall for large amounts of disinformation, and not just that, but also to act upon them? And so it's that sort of common understanding that the information environment creates all these different elements and the ways in which people think that we're really having a huge problem, I believe, in wargaming, trying to grapple with. Because the information environment is, first of all, ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And we're not just talking about social media, right? If you looked at the slide before, the information environment isn't just about what is online, it's all the physical environment that we look at, and everything that happens nowadays is sped up by technology, by the fact that information is more available than it ever was. The information environment is complex. It is not just complex in the sense it's hard to understand, but the intentions of many different actors within it are equally hard to decipher. It's volatile. It can change day by day. One day you can have a fringe group posting online. Next week, they could become the dominant force on a key social media platform. And the reason why that happens is most of the time natural. But it's also uncertain. We never can truly understand fully why things happen in the information environment. And that's mainly because human nature and human reasoning is, of course, unobservable. And that goes to the last point. It's cognitive. The information environment is unobservable in a large degree, and it's within the minds of individuals. And that makes it difficult, all these different elements, to wargame. Because we have traditional models. Matrix games are fantastic when an understanding of the situation is fully created. But expert determination can be subjective. An individual cannot tell you what a Twitter campaign will reasonably do when implemented due to many of the different factors. But then a Kriegspiel may be just as subjective because the gameplay structure determines when and if certain types of campaigns, how campaigns are structured, how they work, when that could change the next day because of people's preferences. And so the IE, the information environment, is too volatile to be properly assessed in these ways. And in a lot of ways, because future warfare, current warfare, is an indeterminate problem, comprises of those things that we don't really know either the initial conditions or the relevant elements of the problem in a lot of ways, we need an unstructured tool. That's why we turn to wargaming. So our solution was to utilize two concepts for matrix games, crowdsourcing and roleplay and prediction, but from the bottom up. So instead of having top-down experts deciding whether or not things work, or a control team, we create an audience, a bottom-up approach, a group of individuals, and the audience, made up of around 30 to 50 people, depending on the exercise, will respond to players' actions, and they make the objectives fundamentally cognitive. And so we get to SemiE. So SemiE, Simulated Information Environment, is comprised of three major elements, which I'll get into shortly. The first element is the psychological domain, our virtual audience. They have limited situational awareness. They understand it's a war game, but they don't know who the teams are. And in most cases, they don't even know there are teams. They act as social media users, and they're provided personas and a scenario. So we're not just throwing people into the war game and saying, okay, you're you go and be you and just post on social media. We actually tell them, role play as somebody who is, let's say, moderate living in this part of the country, or somebody who has this type of employment. So we ask them to attempt to, every single time, make relevant decision-making whenever they go forward to do something online. And then we have a synthetic social media platform, which is fundamentally representing that virtual logic and network that we saw on the previous slide. It's a playing field for the teams that houses the audience and transmits information. And for this, we use Discord. Because Discord, we were able to create the similar conditions for which social media can house, and we could house all the different players and teams. And then lastly, we had an abstract war game or simulation. So something that is material geographical. So the teams representing geopolitical entities, influencers, operational activities, dynamic game states, and it was all conducted live. So none of this was necessarily turn-based. All the actions are happening over a predetermined amount of time, whether it be 4 hours or in one case, a week. And so we had all these different things running simultaneously at the same time, teams having to develop live situational awareness. So what does that look like? Well, in a crude way, kind of looks like this. So we use Google Docs to submit the operations and put them in. And so then you submit them and they go to a master document for which we can adjudicate. The operations will impact situational awareness or the ground truth. What is actually happening? So what is actually going to take place? What are the different geopolitical actors actually doing? And that ground truth provides information for not just teams, but also influencers, players playing as news entities, and various other information actors to submit messaging via a bot. And so the bot delivers the message to our various citizens. They get it in their personalized feed, as you can see there. So each citizen has their own individual feed, and they can be specifically, posts can be specifically tied to, let's say, specific geographical regions. And then what happens is, based on the information, based on the type of reality being created in their feed, which is the only thing they're really able to orient with initially, they go and conduct social media activities. So they go into our various different channels, which we call high space. And they could go into each one and start discussing various different types of information and posting. And the reasoning for which they were doing this was they wanted to figure out what the truth was. And there was conflicting views on what the truth was between different audience members. Therefore, it created conflict between them. And then audience members, what they could do is they could move forward with their own initiatives, whether it be a women's march on the Capitol, which actually had taken place, and around 30 individuals signed something which was sent to control, and then we made it into gameplay truth, or a referendum that took place on autonomy in a part of our simulation, or of our scenario, pardon. And so if you take a look at this loop, it's very complex in the sense that we have control only really managing operations, but everything else that is based on the audience, that's based on the platform, we do not put a finger on that place. The audience is fully able to do what they need to do autonomously, which means control is only handling the ground truth to both the news corporations, the influencers, and the teams about what's actually happening, what is the news. And then that's being filtered through various narratives, through various geopolitical agendas to our audience. And that's all happening live. And so I'll give you an example. And so I always love doing this. So in the chat, left or right, which one is real? So in one of our games, Blue set up an anti-disinformation network, which was quite effective. However, Red decided to copy it and create posts almost exactly the same. Which one is real? So you can type in the chat right or left, and I'll give like a few seconds for that. So in terms of the specific game, and so for those of you who were thinking it is specifically the left one, you are correct. The right one's the fake one, and it's mainly because there's a small graphical glitch, of course, but you can see that many audience members are actually fooled by this. And so we were looking at the dynamics of how that played. And so I'll tell you some general observations about the games that were played. So first of all, powerful capabilities require restraint. It's the first thing we learned. So in an information conflict, in a war over the hearts and minds and over reality itself and creating that reality, we found that actors that deployed powerful capabilities eventually had those come to haunt them later, either because another intelligence agency found that they used it and posted about it online, that was the case, or that in the end, what would happen is that the capability would fail and cause something to happen or an unintended effect to happen. The last part is take advantage of mistakes and turn the narrative around. So when specific influencers representing politicians made mistakes, Red would take advantage immediately of those mistakes and use that to demonize those individuals to win the war game. And in terms of the victory conditions, we were doing some polling of our audience members to be able to specifically look at their different leanings and specific cognitive attitudes towards various different parts of the scenario. So red was able to delegitimize the government, for example, with this tactic. But also blue was able to do this as well. Whenever there was specific mentionings whenever red would, let's say, leak data, blue would immediately go and make it into a press release. Additionally, we had cognitive diversity, out-of-the-box skills, and that was really what was the most important. In a lot of ways, information warfare is not about firing a gun. It's very, very dissimilar to the kind of warfare we look at in the kinetic sense. So it requires a very political-minded person, not necessarily military per se, although it does have a military component. In terms of audience observations, it was impressive what we were able to witness. We saw, for example, emergent behavior, realistic social phenomena take place. And the fact is that many of the different pieces of phenomena we saw, such as polarization, marginalization of moderates, radicalization, were all witnessed in real time developing. In addition, audiences were invested and took active sides in the scenario, and teams were forced to tread the human terrain for the first time. So in another war game where everything was essentially done through control, we would be subjective to control's idea of what would be effective or not. In this, there are real people. Your consequences have meaning. Your actions have meaning because they have clear consequences with a real audience. In terms of red gameplay observations, we found that unsophisticated tactics and restraint were the most important. And unsophisticated tactics in terms of just hyperbole, misattribution, simple botnets, and stoking fear were far more effective than a high-risk operation that involved massive use of cyber capabilities. We also found that red specifically didn't try to influence everyone, but they went for key target audiences that would achieve their end political results. Additionally, the virtual information domain provided the military initiative. It gave red the ability to justify military action, and the audience played into it. And lastly, casual and fun content proved highly effective, as you can see with the beaver here. Yes, they're building barricades on the streets, but your local cartoon character supports it. And lastly, blue gameplay observations. We found that preoccupation with the adversary is dangerous and ultimately slowed the OODA loops, your observation, orientation, decision, actions. And that's mainly because blue needs to be able to play its own game. We're not going to be able to play red's game, and we can never play red's game. But what we can do is attempt to counter disinformation targetedly and attempt to create our own narrative and be able to say, this is what's actually happening, provide the facts, and provide real information. As well, identifying red influencers and target audiences. So looking at what audiences are being targeted and why are they so susceptible? And what social grievances do they have and how can that be addressed that red is taking advantage of? In addition, engagement with influencers proved successful. They were working very much with influencers the whole time. Oh, pardon. And lastly, information is a politics game. So in some war games, there was interaction with the audience was very important. Sometimes that was forgotten, and that's when things would trip up. So with that being said, I will end it here. And thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.